Sewing jackets are tough, but not when you have a video tutorial to help. In this video, I'll show you every step for sewing this edgy and fashionable peplum jacket from McCall's pattern 7513. This pattern is highly versatile and can easily make a winter jacket or an office blazer. We'll learn how to sew sleeves, put all the pieces together, and how to sew a pleated peplum. This jacket is made from view A of the pattern. It's a hip-length jacket with a pleated peplum at the back. For this style, you'll need at least 1.8 meters of fabric. The fabric should be medium to heavy weight, depending on the season you'll be using it for, and it should be stiff enough to hold the pleats. I'm using a novelty brocade-like fabric to make a light jacket, but you can also use suiting materials, corduroy and velvet. You need 1.4 meters of lining fabric. I used a satin lining. You'll also need 1.3 meters of interfacing and 6 buttons of about 2 cm diameter. Measure your bust and waist to determine your size. This jacket is quite fitted, so you'll need to size up if either of your bust or waist is too big for the size. There's not much room for adjustments. I'd consider this jacket to be an average difficulty. Sewing the sleeves and buttonholes will be difficult for true beginners. But if you've sewn a few patterns and you want to move on to jackets, then I encourage you to follow this video. For this project, you'll need to cut out pattern pieces 1 to 10 and 13. When we cut out the pattern, we follow the line indicated as our size all the way around the outside of the pattern. We don't cut into the pattern. Cut around the lowest edges of piece 9 and 10 and not around the cutting line for view A. Your pattern instructions will have a diagram for the order of pieces to cut out for your size and the width of your fabric. The shaded pieces must be placed face down on the fabric, and the pieces with an asterisk must be cut on one layer. My fabric is 150 centimeters wide and I'm making a size 12, so I'm using the third diagram for view A. The diagram shows that you need to fold the fabric in half widthwise to bring the selvages together. The first pieces that we place on the fabric are piece 1 and 5. With piece 1 being placed next to the fold and piece 5 next to the selvages. Each pattern piece has an arrow at the center of the pattern called the grain line. Use a measuring tape to make sure that this arrow is parallel with the selvages or the fold of the fabric. Pin all around the inside of the pattern and close to the edge. Starting from the folded edge, place pieces 2, then 3 and align these with the fold. Turn piece 4 upside down on top of the fabric and arrange it so that it's parallel to the fold. Get noses into the space made by pieces 3 and 5. Cut around the pattern and look out for the triangles around the edge of the pattern pieces. These are the notches, which help us match and align the pieces. We mark out the notches by making a small triangle just out the edge of the pattern. Pin piece 6 next to the fold and piece 13 beside it. Piece 8 is a little more difficult to cut and we'll be coming back to it later. For now, pin the grain line of piece 8 directly on top of the fold of the fabric and leave plenty of space around it to cut out the other pieces. Piece 9 is placed above piece 13. Align it with the fold and use a few pins to hold it in place. This piece has a cut line for view A around the center. We fold along this line and pin it into place. Now you can cut along the required length without ruining the pattern piece. Place piece 10 at the center of the fabric. pay no attention to the bottom of the pattern piece and how it doesn't completely fit on the fabric. Again, fold the pattern piece along the cutting line for view A and pin all the edges. Now we go back to piece 8. Place pins into the fabric so that they only pass through the pattern piece and the top layer of the fabric. Unfold the fabric and pin the other side of the pattern. Next we cut the lining. We fold the fabric in half widthwise again. Pin and cut out pieces 2, 3, 5 and 7. The lining for piece 5 is slightly shorter than the fabric, so fold along the cutting line for the lining and then pin and cut. Several pieces of this jacket must be interfaced, including pieces 4, 6, 9 and 13. Piece 9 is a little tricky. You only need to interface a small rectangle at the edge that is closest to the center front of the jacket. You need to fold your pattern along the lines for the center front and the hem for view A. Cut these lines and the rest of the pattern to make a rectangle. This interfacing will be folded inside of the jacket as the facing. Fuse or sew your interfacing to the wrong side of the matching fabric pieces. Use the notches to help you place the interfacing for piece 9. We need to sew one dart into each of piece 1. Darts are marked by the triangles on the pattern. We must sew these lines together to help shape the jacket. Here's my easy method for sewing perfect darts. Roughly pin the pattern piece to the wrong side of the fabric. Place extra pins in the center of the dart, just away from the line. Remove the pins that are not inside the dart marking. Fold your pattern piece along the dart line. Using a ruler and tailor's chalk, mark this line onto the fabric and do this for both sides of the dart. Unpin and remove the pattern piece. We must now fold the fabric in half along the center of the dart. Here's how I do it. Pinch the fabric at the tip of the triangle and roughly fold it in half. We now move along the dart and check that the dart markings are aligned by poking a needle through the layers and checking that it passes through both the markings. Sew along the dart markings. Trim away the excess fabric next to the seam and finish the seam. Spread the seam open with your iron. Grab the fabric and the lining for piece 2. Pin these pieces to themselves along the long edge with the triple notch. Make sure they're right sides together. Sew together with the normal 1.5 cm seam allowance. Piece 3 is now sewn to the other side of the long edge of piece 2, with right sides facing together. Match each of the corners and the single notch. You'll need to do this for both pieces of piece 2 for the fabric and the lining. Sew into place. Finish all the seams so far. You don't need to trim the seams. This allows for tailoring in the future. Here's where the main fabric and the lining start to differ. For the fabric, we take piece 1 and sew it to piece 2 and 3 at the top and the shorter side. The top seam is the shoulder seam and it is matched by a single notch. The side seam is matched by a double notch to piece 3. Start by stay stitching between the 2 notches on the long edge of piece 6. To stay stitch, we sew on one layer at 1 cm seam allowance. This stitch prevents the piece from stretching with stress. For the lining, the front is formed from 2 pieces. Note that piece 6 is made in the fabric but is part of the lining called the facing. Pin piece 6 to 7 with right sides together. Match the double notches. Sew piece 6 to 7 with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. This seam is curved between the notches, so I suggest slightly stretching piece 6 as you sew to prevent any tucks in the seam. Like with piece 1, we now sew piece 6 and 7 to the rest of the lining that we've sewn. We do this by sewing together at the shoulder and side seams. We match the notches at the top edge and the double notches at the side. The top edge has 2 seams which must be aligned for a neat look. Here's my method for aligning the seams. Press the pieces together where they need to be aligned. Measure 1.5 cm down the aligning seam. Now split the pieces apart so you can view down where the seam will be sewn. Check that the seam is aligning nicely. Sew over this area at 1.5 cm without backstitching. Open the pieces up and check that they align. If not, you can easily pull out the temporary seam. Sew the rest of the shoulder and side seams for the lining. We now sew the collar pieces to the main fabric and the lining. Piece 4 comes in 2 pieces, so we need to sew them together. Pin and sew piece 4 to itself down the side with the triple notches. Pin the pattern to the wrong side of the fabric. Fold back the pattern along the circles at the corners and mark the circles onto the fabric. Grab the main body of fabric that you've sewn. Align the centre back of the body of the fabric with the centre seam of piece 4. Sew along the seam at 1.5 cm and check that it's aligned nicely. Pin the rest of piece 4 to the main fabric using extra pins around the curves. You need to sew from one chalk marking to the other at 1.5 cm seam allowance. Backstitch over the markings a few times to reinforce them. Now we work on piece 8. Grab the pattern and pin it to the fabric. Mark the 2 circles just as you did for piece 4. Also, fold the fabric in half and chalk a marking for the centre. We now pin piece 8 to the neck of the lining. Match the centre back seam of the lining with the centre of piece 8. Pin outwards from the centre back, placing extra pins around the curved area. Again, sew with a seam allowance of 1.5 cm from the chalk marking to the other chalk marking. Lay out the main body so that it's facing right side up. Take the lining and lay it down on top of the main body so that the right sides are now together. Start pinning the raw edges of the collar together. This next part is tricky. You need to align the seams where the collars are attached to the main body and the lining. These are represented by the dot markings. You must not sew over this area when you sew the body and the lining together. Pin outwards from the seam. Pin the raw edges of piece 1 and 6 together. Make a marking about 2.5 centimeters from the bottom edge of piece 1 and 6. Start sewing from this marking with a regular seam allowance. Turn the corner, then stop before you reach the collar seam. Restart sewing the collar just after the dot markings. Doing this creates an elegant notch in the collar. Sew around both the corners of the collar and stop before the seam where it attaches to the body, aka the dot marking. Rinse and repeat. Restart sewing piece 1 to 6, but be sure to stop at the marking that you made at the bottom edge. Trim off all the corners for the seam that you just made, then trim off about half of the seam allowance. Cut triangles into the seam allowance of the collar to create a smooth look. Finish all the raw edges so far, but make sure that you keep the bottom edge open. Grab a needle and make a double thread. For the best look for a notched collar, you need to hand sew it shut. Do your best to hide the knot inside of the seam. Make small tight stitches with your needle along the seam. Try to knot off in the seam or on the back side of the collar. All done with the collar, time to sew the sleeves. Firstly, we need to sew an easing stitch onto the shoulder of the sleeves. Set your stitch length to as long as possible on the straight stitch. Pull out the bobbin and the spool thread from the machine. We sew from notch to notch with a 1 cm seam allowance. You must not backstitch while doing this. Once you're done, pull a generous amount of the thread out of the machine. Now we repeat this process with a 2 cm seam allowance. If you have a delicate fabric which may be damaged by removing stitching, then I suggest skipping the second easing stitch. Repeat this for the lining. Fold the sleeve in half widthwise and sew down the length at 1.5 cm. Do the same for the lining, and finish the seams. Next, we refer back to the circles on the pattern sheet at the shoulder seam. Copy these markings onto the wrong side of the fabric with your tailor's chalk. Do the same for the sleeve lining. You also need to chalk out the matching circle markings on the main body using pattern pieces 1 and 3. These circle markings are also on pieces 3 and 7 for the lining. Take the main body of the jacket and put it on top of the sleeve at the edge to be attached. You must make sure that you've got the right sleeve by checking that the right notches are together. There is 1 single notch and 1 double notch. Align the side seam for the sleeve and the armhole. We now ease the sleeve into the armhole. Match the marking at the top of the sleeve with the shoulder seam. We now need to very lightly gather the sleeve to help us match the rest of the markings. Gently pull 1 thread for each of the rows of the easing stitch on the same side of the fabric. The fabric will begin to gather and you can push the gathers along the shoulder of the sleeve. The sleeve only needs to be a little crinkled at the edges, so pull the thread closest to the edge a little more. The fabric should be flat at about 1.5 centimeters where the seam will be sewn. Adjust the easing stitch until all the chalk markings on the sleeve and the armhole match. Pin the rest of the sleeve into place and make sure that it's flat at 1.5 centimeters. Sew all around the shoulder seam at 1.5 centimeters. If you still get tucks in the seam as you sew, then you can always unpick around the tuck for a few centimeters, then smooth out the seam and try again. Use the same method for sewing the sleeves to the lining.